Hi, welcome back to educator.com. This lesson will cover the use of the CSS visual styling language with XML documents. If you've ever opened an XML document in a browser, you'll notice that there's something lacking visually. For example, let's take a look at the file called message0.xml. I'm looking at it in a text editor right here, and it's our basic message document type that we've seen before. If I open it in a browser, however, it doesn't really look like the way a web page looks like. I can see all the tags. I've got this interesting little bit of interactivity here where I can use this minus sign to kind of fold up all the nested tags into their parent, but that's really not all that exciting compared to what I can do with an HTML web page. So what we're going to do in this lesson we will take a review of the CSS language, for those of you who may not be as familiar with it from work with HTML. We're going to take a look at what an XML processing instruction is and how we can use it to apply a CSS style sheet to our XML document. We're going to be looking at how we can use CSS to affect basic page layout and also different types of visual style. So let's take a look at CSS. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and it's a standard developed by the World Wide Web Consortium specifically for styling not only web pages but any sort of web document, including anything created with XML. CSS is not particular. It's been in development for quite a long time. The most recent version is 2.1, which is just about to finally be done after about a decade of steady work on it. And they're coming out with version 3 in pieces. So look for that to come out. Some browsers already support parts of CSS 3, but we'll be focusing on version 2.1. The CSS is done with what are called selectors. We determine which element is going to have a particular collection of style rules applied to it using the selector to describe what element we're picking. And then within curly braces here we have our property name followed by a colon followed by the property's value. And there are dozens of CSS properties. We're only going to be looking at a few of them in this lesson. If you're familiar with CSS from HTML, you know that you can embed CSS in your page in style elements and style attributes. There's no such functionality built into XML, so all of our CSS is going to be in external CSS files. For example, you can see one in the file called messagestyle.css, which is specifically designed for our message document type, where I'm applying a style to the from element. I'm saying I want it to have extra large font size, and I want the text decoration to have an underline. And in the to element, I'd like the font weight to be bold. But a CSS file by itself is not particularly useful. We need to attach it to a document to let a document know that it needs to look to these style instructions in order to render the document visually. For that, we need an XML processing instruction. These are special insertions into your XML file that provide additional information to the XML processor, which is the software portion that reads the XML, makes sure it's constructed validly, and passes all its information onto the browser or whatever program it's a part of. It's done with corner brackets like an HTML element or an XML element, only we include these question marks to make it very clear to the processor that this is not an element, this is something else. So we put in the processing instruction name, and you can't just make up your own processing instructions. There are specific ones that you either can use or can't use. And then you include what are called pseudo attributes. They're kind of like element attributes, but since this is not an element, they're not really attributes, so these are pseudo attributes. That's the only reason for that kind of name. So a processing instruction that pulls a style sheet into an XML file is done this way. We have the curly braces with the question marks. We have the phrase XML style sheet. We have a type attribute saying we're looking for a text file that is written in the CSS language. And we have a hyperlink reference to the file that contains our style information, which in the case of this particular processing instruction would be messagestyle.css. This was laid out in a standard by the Web Consortium called Associating Style Sheets with XML Documents 1.0. It's a very short one-page standard, basically. If you'd like to take a look at all the nitty-gritty of it, you can find the web address for it right there on the slide here. And let's take a look at an example of how we put this to use. I have a file here called message1.xml, and it is pretty much the exact same as the previous message file we were looking at, except that I have added the XML style sheet processing instruction right at the top. So in this case, we're pulling in a file called messagestyle1.css, and that is this file here. It's actually the same style sheet instructions as the previous CSS file we were looking at, but I've decided to number them to keep it straight. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at this file in a browser and see what happens when we apply these style instructions to the content of our XML elements. So if we take a look at it in a browser, message1.xml, we see that now it looks a little bit more web page-like. The text is rendered without the element tags showing, and the style rules that I've specified have been applied. However, we're seeing kind of a problem here because all the text is in one line. Just like in HTML, any line returns or tabs that you put in your source code have nothing to do with how the text renders on screen. And so when your XML processor reads through the content and eliminates the tags, it just sends everything through as though it were part of one paragraph. If we want to control the layout, it helps to know about a CSS property called display. Let's take a look at that. The display property has a number of different values, but the two most useful ones for our purposes here are the values block and inline. Block display is for large portions of a document, such as paragraphs or headings or block quotes, that sort of thing. And an inline displayed element would be something like, let's say, a piece of italicized text within a paragraph. Something that doesn't need its own space on the page, may go across more than one line of the content that surrounds it, but it's part of that block content. So what we'd like to do then is apply some block display to the elements on our page. Let's take a look at how that works. All of the message.xml files that are included are all pretty much the same file, but each one of them pulls in the next numbered style sheet. So let's look at messagestyle2.css, and I've added a line right at the top here. This asterisk is called the universal selector, and it applies style to every single element on the page. And I'm saying I want everything to have block display, which means the content of each of the elements is going to appear on its own line and leave a little space for the elements around it rather than having them all go on one line. And other than that, I've kept the styles the same. So let's take a look at our message2.xml file. So with block display, our elements look a little bit more like we might expect them to in a message type of document, each of them on their own line. We can go further with that, though, in terms of our styling. Let's take a look at messagestyle3.css. Now I've added some extra styling here. The entire document type is going to have a thick solid black border around it. And the from element, which is what contains my return address essentially, the bottom of that element is going to have a medium dashed blue border. And if we take a look at message3.xml in the browser, it looks like this. Now we have a thick, solid black border around our whole message and a blue dash border underneath the sender, again, kind of separating it out from the rest of the message. So each time we're getting a little bit closer to something that's a little bit more appealing looking. We can also change the font. We added some font style to begin with, but we can make other changes as well. Message style 4 makes further changes. I'm saying that my from element should be large and bold. I'm using the font property, where I can specify a lot of different features about a particular font that I'm using. The message text, I'm saying I want it to be 24 pixels sans serif. That means it's not going to be like Times New Roman. It's going to be something more like Arial or Tahoma, something like that. And if I look at message4.xml in my browser, those styles are applied here. I see I have a sans serif font here, and my style has been applied up here in the from element. So I can make these changes to my CSS. I can affect the layout. I can affect decorations around the edges of my elements. I can affect the text. I can also affect other things such as color and the use of background images. If I take a look at message5.css, message style 5.css, I should say, we've added a background image that's going to kind of hang out to the right of our entire message. And I've added some color to my from element right here. And if we open up message5.xml in our browser, we can see how that looks. And it looks just like this. So now we're getting something that looks a lot more web page-like and gives us some good visual style to our pages. So in this lesson, we've learned that XML doesn't have to be plain. It can be styled with CSS to give it layout and an appealing appearance. And there are a lot of resources on the web to find out specific problems with CSS. Not every browser implements it exactly the same way. So as long as you avoid some of these potential pitfalls, you'll be fine. Thank you for visiting educator.com.